This is the kind of challenge that's my meat. I love it. Let's roll. Let's do it. No anguish, no fasting, no prayer, no brokenness. Let's just do it. Nothing would have been done. The walls would have never been rebuilt. And anything you try to do without this baptism of anguish, it's going to falter and fall. It's not going to work. Here's what a sister wrote to me this past week. She said, Brother Dave, I'm so hungry for the Lord. I'm so tired of how-to meetings. It's all spiritual fluff. I was told of a women's conference that was going to be a great spiritual experience, so I went with a group of sisters. There were 15,000 women. I was horrified the first night when they opened the conference with a comedy sketch. It went from bad to worse. We were hoodwinked by the leaders. There was not a single prayer, not one mention of prayer. It was a farce. And I'm as empty as I've ever been. Prophet Amos cried out to such, woe to them that are ease in Zion, eating, chanting their music, but they're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. And in the original Hebrew root word, they are not agonizing in prayer over the ruin in Joseph or Israel. They're not agonizing. They're not in anguish about the conditions. Comedy, yes. Happy singing, yes. Eating, fellowship, good time, yes. Weeping, anguish, praying, fasting, no, no, no. Will not have it. Folks, let me tell you something. Out of this baptism of anguish comes a marvelous thing that happens to those willing to submit to it. A marvelous thing. It's the instant, prompt knowing of God's voice. Instant. Now see, if you don't have a history of prayer, if you don't have this willingness to share God's heart, you get it by asking Him for it. He said, I'll give. I'm more willing to give, you are to receive. This is something you ask. Oh God, I want to step out now and I want to know your heart. And when you begin to seek His face, you allow Him to melt and break you. You come into this communion with the Lord. Out of that experience, you see, God hasn't called us to live in anguish. This is the birth, this is the womb of something God is stirring, God wanting to accomplish and bringing out of ruin, restoration in your family, whatever it may be. He'll bring you down into this baptism. Now, just like the baptism of waters, you come up, you come out. But you'll come out with this instant knowing of God's voice. Because you see, Nehemiah, he'd been fasting, he'd been praying, he'd been mourning and left a mark on his countenance. And the king noticed that he was a cupbearer. And one day he brings the wine to the king, and the king says, why are you so down? Why your countenance? Nehemiah didn't have time to go unbosom his heart to the Lord. He didn't have time now to go and say, give me 3 days to fast and pray. No, he had to have an instant word. Why your sad countenance? Nehemiah said, I was very sore afraid. So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king. In other words, instant prayer, instant direction. Knowing God's voice. There are times you're not going to know what to do. You have no time to run to the closet. You have to hear His voice. This is the way, walk in it. Instant. That is a glorious result of the baptism of anguish. The servant who willingly takes on the mantle of God's pain is the only servant who has the authority and the right to hold God to his covenant promises. We've preached covenant here. But only those who've known his heart and in those times have allowed God to bring healing and has allowed God to go down deep in the soul and say, oh God, I can't do this on my own, but I'm not going to let my kids go to hell. I'm not going to let my husband, my wife. Oh God, I'm not going to live in this death. I'm not going to live in this lukewarmness and this coldness anymore. God, change me. And when you get desperate before God, you set your heart to seek him. Then you can hold God to his covenant promises. Look at first chapter verses 8 and 9. Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if you transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations. Now he holds God this covenant now. But if you turn unto me and keep my commandments and do them, though there were most of you cast out from the uttermost part of the heaven, yet will I gather them from thence and bring them into this place that I've chosen to set my name there. He calls on the covenant made to Moses. He said, here's what you promised, God. And folks, when you allow God to lead you into this place beyond concern, beyond just fleeting emotion, you say, God, I'm going to set my heart. Then you have every right to hold God to every one of his covenant promises. You see, and I'm going to close in just a minute. We have a nation, a church today full of diagnostic experts. Boy, just about anybody can tell you what's wrong with the church now. And now they're coming out with statistics and polls. They can tell you how many heathen there are in China. They can give you polls and charts, but not the slightest idea. They have all these how-to books now. You won't hear one word about anguish, tears, and brokenness. You won't hear that. In my closing thoughts, I want to ask you, why did Nehemiah, of all God-fearing men that were left in Israel, why did God share his anguished heart with Nehemiah? Because he was a man of prayer. He was already in prayer. Now I want to tell you something. I believe in destiny. I believe that God chooses men. But God can choose a man and he can abort it just like that. Nehemiah could have said, look, I have more influence right here. I have the ear of the king. I need to stay right here. And God, I'm sure I'll agree with you that God will raise up somebody. No, he said, oh God, this is my burden. Open your heart to me. I know now it's going to take more than preaching, more than a new revelation. There's going to be no renewal, no revival, no awakening until we're willing to let him once again break us. I don't know why. I don't know if it's something that's coming. The other pastors have shared with you what they feel about some very, very troubling, difficult times just ahead. And comes not only from the pulpit, it comes from politicians coming from all over the world. But I have to tell you, that God's calling me personally to a baptism of anguish. I don't know what it's all about right now.